Well, good morning. My name is Stanton Jones, and I'm with technology research and advisory services firm ISG. I want to give a big thank you to the nasscom team for inviting me here today to speak to you about both headwinds and tailwinds that we see in the GCC sector here in India. As part of my role at ISG, I'm an industry analyst. So one of the key areas I cover is the intersection of the IT services sector and the GCC sector. Now, obviously, a huge amount of that activity takes place here in India. And as I was thinking about what I was going to share with you today, I started thinking about the first time that I came to India. And that was 16 years ago. And I'm going to show you a picture of that. So this is yours truly, way back in 2008. I was 36 at the time. Probably infer how old I am today. So I was here in 2008 to help set up our GCC capability. Now, we didn't call it a GCC back then. And something I'm really proud of is that today, if you look at ISG India, that's what it is. It's ISG India. It's not a GCC. I was thinking about the conversation that we had yesterday about this term around GCC. That really hit me last night. I was like, this is ISG India. And I have one of my colleagues here. She heads our research here in India. She's just from our India office, right? Just like from our Nordics office or from our Australia office. So I think that's pretty cool, just from a reflection from last night. So the reason I wanted to share this story with you, a couple of reasons. Number one, back then I was a CIO, and so I was actually helping to get this set up. So I do have some practical experience around the challenges around setting up a GCC. I haven't been an analyst my whole life. Now, obviously, the scale that we were doing this at is probably much smaller than most of you, but I think a lot of the challenges are pretty similar. But I think something else that's really similar is, as I was thinking this through, in a lot of ways, 2008 almost kind of feels like what's happening today here in 2024. So if you think back to 2028, very uncertain economic environment, very strong focus on cost optimization and risk reduction. There was this new technology called cloud that was emerging. At the time I was the CIO, I was thinking about moving our email to the cloud and CRM to the cloud. Of course, we have those in the cloud today, but back then that was pretty new. That was driving very strong demand for new skills and capabilities. And at the time, India was very much at the center of that, but it was very much around cost optimization. That was the key driver. So fast forward to 2024, in some ways, things feel very similar to me. We are in a very uncertain economic environment. Enterprises are laser focused on cost optimization and risk reduction, but there is a big change on the technology side. There's this thing called AI. Today, the focus is on generative AI, but in my opinion, the rise of generative AI is bringing back demand for predictive AI, all things AI. And that is driving unprecedented levels of demand for skills and talent to solve for this challenge. And in my opinion, India is right at the center of this. But today, it's not just about cost optimization. That is still important. It's talent. It's talent at the scale and at the cost that global enterprises need. So let's do a quick level set. I mentioned that I kind of work at the intersection of these two sectors. We've heard this several times over the past day or so. The GCC sector here in India, around 1.6 million people with a very impressive 11% CAGR. If you look at the IT services sector here in India, it's around 5 million people and about an 8% CAGR, just depending on which providers you put into the bucket. So what's driving this incredibly strong activity on that 11%? Let's look at that. I think it really boils down to three factors. Number one, it's around talent. I just mentioned that. Attracting and retaining tech and domain-specific talent and skills. Clearly, value is still an important driver, and we're talking about value in the form of cost, productivity, or speed. We're talking about bottom line impact. And innovation is a key driver. We're talking about driving transformation in technology, process, or in products. We heard some really cool examples of those yesterday. So let's look at where enterprises are today in terms of their GCC journey. We just wrapped up one of our GCC studies, and we asked, using this framework of these three factors, what's your primary benefit today? Almost half said value. So remember, we're talking about a bottom line impact. About a third said talent, so attracting and retaining domain and tech-specific talent. And then about 20% said innovation, and we're defining innovation here around transformation of technology, process, or product. So this is kind of where I feel like we are today as we look at the data, through our interviews, and through our client work. Let's talk about where we think we're going to go in the next 24 months. So we also looked at the data for those companies that had built or acquired a GCC in the past 24 months. What are their plans? About 50% say they're going to expand staff in the next 24 months. Now, before I show you this next data point, I want to remind you why NASScom invited me here to speak to you today. Tailwinds and headwinds. About the same number say that they are going to reduce staff in the next 24 months. So let's talk about why that is. And interestingly, it's the same reasons. It's the ability or inability to attract and retain domain and tech-specific talent. It's the ability or inability to drive value in the form of speed, productivity, or cost. It's the ability or inability to drive innovation. And this is one of the main points I want to get across to you today is that, and it's also the reason that if you noticed, I highlighted the word activity on this slide, and the first time I showed it to you, is because the activity around GCCs is unprecedented, but it's unprecedented on both sides. Companies want to scale or build their GCC, and companies rethinking their GCC approach. So let's look at these three factors then against a headwind and tailwind framework, maybe to kind of tease out where do we think this is going to go over the next 24 months or so. Let's start with talent. As we've talked about, attracting and retaining talent is a critical decision factor in GCC decision-making today. In fact, I think it's the primary reason. Underlying that is innovation, but you need the talent to drive that innovation. That said, I think it's important to keep in mind this intersection of the IT services sector and the GCC sector. I see a large number of enterprises agreeing with me that India is probably the only place on the planet that you can find the talent you need, at the scale you need, the cost you need. Where they disagree with me is that they view India, not all, but many, view India as a volatile talent market. And I think that's a direct result of what happened in 2021 and 2022 in the IT services sector. At one point during this time frame, 50% of the IT services sector, of the employees in the IT services sector, had been with their firm for less than a year. Now, obviously, that was a great time if you were an employee moving in between GCCs and the IT services sector, right? But if you think it through the lens of an enterprise where half the people servicing their account have been on their account for less than a year, it's a huge amount of disruption. So enterprises remember that. If you think about this as a tailwind, as I said, talent is a top 3, and now it's typically kind of a top 1 to 2 driver in pretty much every buyer behavior study we do. Every time we're out with a client, it's almost always talent right at the top. And I believe India is really the only place on the planet that can solve for this at the scale and cost Global 2000 enterprises need. That said, I think there is a headwind coming, and that's around discretionary spending. So what's happening in the IT services sector right now is it's in a low single-digit growth environment, And that's because discretionary spending has been under a lot of pressure over the past 18 months or so. That will come back. We're forecasting it to come back probably late in the fourth quarter. And when it comes back, hiring is going to start again in the IT services sector. And so for GCCs that have maybe started in the last year or 2 years that have never really faced competition from the IT services sector, I think we're going to start to see it there. Let's look at value on a headwind, tailwind basis as well. So as I mentioned earlier, about half of enterprises view value as the primary benefit of their GCC, but it's also by far and away the most common reason that we see enterprises either consolidating or even exiting their GCC. Cost optimization is super important right now. It's a huge priority within enterprises. We are starting to see it ease a little bit. Decision making is speeding up a little bit. Hurdle rates are starting to come down a little bit, so that's good news, potentially an indication that things are starting to loosen up a little bit. But as an indicator of how strong this cost optimization focus is right now, let's go back to the IT services sector. 2023 was the best year in a decade for what we call mega deals, and that's an outsourcing of award of 100 million of ACV or greater. There's almost 6 billion of ACV signed in 2023. And keep in mind, some of those deals had a GCC component to them, meaning the GCC was monetized into the IT services sector. So keep that in mind as we continue to look at what's going to happen with the economy and the associated cost pressure. As I mentioned, enterprise hurdle rates are very elevated right now. We do feel like they're starting to come down a bit. But I think there is a potential tailwind here for the GCC sector, and that is the explosion of new models that enterprises can take advantage of in order to get access to their GCC vision. Of course, we continue to see a lot of enterprises using the build, operate, transfer, or BOT model, but lots of new providers, lots of interesting things emerging, just focused on, for example, the build, or just on the operate, just focused on recruiting, just focused on real estate, just focused on marketing and branding. Lots of new options that we're introducing to our clients in order to help them realize their GCC visions. Okay, let's finish up with innovation. My feeling is there is a very strong undercurrent right now of enterprises feeling like they've lost their ability to innovate, that they've lost control. So I see that in almost every one of our conversations now. We see this a lot in the data. And I think that's what's driving a lot of this demand here, especially it's related to innovation. In my view, innovation, of course, this is really cool, and we want to do lots of proof of concepts and science projects, but ultimately, it only makes sense if it can be scaled across the organization. And we heard a few examples of this yesterday of how innovation is being incubated within a GCC and scaled across the rest of the organization. And I think that GCC model makes that possible. That said, if you can think about this as a headwind, I see a large number of enterprises as well, especially those that feel like they have lost their ability to innovate, thinking about a GCC like outsourcing. And I don't think that's going to work. There is an immense amount of cultural and operating model change in order to get to a place where you are ISG India, company India. It's not a GCC, it's just where we operate from. We hire globally, depending on where the skills are. It's a huge change. I know many of you have already made that change, but most organizations, I would say, have not. And I view that as a big headwind in order to realize the full value of a GCC. So we've talked about the 3 factors that I think are driving this key activity, this very strong activity. And also, I think ultimately what is coming here is something that we've been talking quite a bit about, and you're probably not going to be surprised at what this is, but I think it's going to change all 3 of these in a big way, and I think it actually already is. And of course, that's AI. So let me show you some things that are happening inside of companies right now. So we're forecasting a 3x increase in AI spending inside of enterprises through 2025. And we also see that only 23% of organizations have the AI skills that they need. So I think we are right at the cusp of a perfect AI storm. We have flat IT and technology budgets on the whole, flat, mixed with a strong desire to dramatically increase technology spending related to AI. We don't have the skills that we need to execute on this to drive cost optimization and eventually innovation into our enterprise. So I think we are right at a perfect storm related to AI. Let's talk about how this could potentially be a headwind and a tailwind for the GCC sector. In terms of headwinds, I feel like today most of the use cases that we see today related to AI are focused on productivity and cost. And so what I mean by that is if you think about internal knowledge sharing use cases, agent productivity use cases, code generation use cases, all very much focused on the strengths of large language models around language, but pretty much internal, focused on productivity and cost. So the challenge for the GCC sector here is that the IT services sector is all over this. So we're seeing promises of 30 to 60% productivity and cost improvement on a lot of these internal use cases through the IT services sector. Now today, those are promises. We haven't yet started to see contracts at this level. Obviously, and a lot of this depends on the composition of generative AI, predictive AI, tooling, process, location, all of that coming together, I think is really what's making up these big promises. It's not all just generative AI. But if the macro situation gets worse, then I think those GCCs that are primarily focused on that value proposition, really bottom line, potentially could struggle because there's going to be opportunities, and we're going to see IT services coming after those opportunities to potentially monetize them given this productivity and cost improvement. Let's talk about AI as a tailwind, which is much more exciting in my opinion. As I mentioned, AI is absolutely a supply problem. This is not a demand problem. I think we're going to see an explosion over the next probably 24 months of domain and context-specific small language models. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Small language models potentially on device. Small language models. I think we're going to see an explosion of innovation of that over the next 24 months, and there is just not nearly enough supply to meet that demand. And I believe India is the only country on the planet that can solve this demand and skills problem at the scale and at the cost that Global 2000 enterprises are looking for today. So given all of this, let's talk about what this potentially means. So we talked about the three factors driving the strong activity. We talked about AI, and we talked about the macro situation. So this is what I believe is coming over the next 24 months. I think the tailwinds will be very strong for micro GCCs. So we're talking 150, 100 folks or less. So I think we're going to see a lot of focus on enterprises building micro GCCs focused specifically on AI and ML skills. We have a number of clients executing on that as we speak today. So I think there's a very strong demand for AI and ML skills. Increase in budgets is going to be a strong tailwind for micro GCCs. I think large GCCs will also see a lot of tailwinds from this environment. I think they'll use their scale to continue to drive value. I think they'll use their size and presence to continue to attract the right talent that they need. And I think they'll use their size in terms of the integration with the overall enterprise. Many of them probably already at a place where they've already made the operating model changes, the cultural changes, where they are just viewed as company India. And I think that's a prerequisite in order to drive the innovation that we've been talking about so much and scale those incredibly compelling AI and ML use cases across the enterprise and potentially even out to external customers as external products, as we heard a couple of times yesterday. So I'm going to leave you with 3 things to think about. Let me talk about the mid-sized GCCs. So this is where I think the headwinds will likely hit hardest. And so I do not mean here that we are going to see mid-sized GCCs disappear. I do think, though, that the headwinds that we've talked about, especially around cost optimization and value, are going to hit some of the mid-sized GCCs that are potentially not well aligned with their parent organization. And I also think that mid-sized GCCs will also, in some cases, struggle to attract the talent that they need to execute on a lot of the innovation projects that enterprises are looking for today. So I think tailwinds for small and large, headwinds for GCCs in the middle. Okay, let me leave you with 3 things to think about, 3 things that potentially could impact this model, this dumbbell model that I've just showed you. Number 1 would be interest rates. Obviously, we're talking about interest rates here in the US and in Europe. If interest rates come down, and we've kind of stopped trying to predict what will happen with interest rates, if interest rates come down, we think that we're going to start to see a lot of this discretionary spending come back. That's ultimately a net good, I think, for all of us, but I think that will then start to drive more growth in the IT services sector, and so for enterprises that are potentially new into the GCC journey, potentially some more competition for talent. If interest rates go up, I think we're likely to see even more of a cost optimization focus within enterprises, and that could put a lot of pressure on enterprises that are primarily focused on that value proposition. Number 2, the regulatory environment. We heard a little bit about this yesterday. I would just see that and encourage anything that India can do to continue to facilitate the export of your technology services that make it easier to import those technology services is a good thing. I also would keep an eye on the environment in the EU. We just heard a little bit about what's happening there. We see a number of clients in the EU wanting to move and build GCCs in India, and we see a number of them building some of those micro GCCs focused on AI and ML skills. But given EU data privacy regulations, a lot of the work stays in the EU. Now, it typically goes to an Eastern European country. That would be a nearshoring arrangement for a Western European country. So I just think that's a little bit of a governor to the growth of the GCC sector. Nothing I'm concerned about, but I think it will put a little bit of a governor on the growth, given the ability to move some of those data and products here to India from the EU. The last thing I'd encourage you to keep an eye on is IT services results. As I mentioned here, we're in a low single-digit growth environment. Hiring has been basically flat over the past 4 quarters. That sector is actually a little bit smaller today than it was at the end of 2022. So that hiring has been flat, and I think that's been a bit of a tailwind for GCCs. When demand starts to pick up, which we think will be in the 4th quarter, we think that hiring is going to start to pick up, certainly not to the degree that we saw in 2021 and 2022, but we do believe that that's going to start to pick up. So keep that in mind through your recruiting plans for the balance of the year. So I want to thank you very, very much for your time, and I want to leave you with a couple of things. Number 1, I am on LinkedIn. You can see my email here, and I do publish a weekly newsletter called the ISG Index Insider. I encourage you to subscribe to that. It's a really quick read, a data-rich read. If you do subscribe, and if you unsubscribe, I will know. So please subscribe. I do want to make sure and mention, though, I'm kind of looking at my QR code, and I'm comparing that to the QR code I saw yesterday, which was like this big. So if this doesn't work for any reason, it's not working on your scanner, let me know. Just Google ISG Index Insider, and that'll get you to the newsletter sign up. Thank you very much, NASScom, and thank you all very much for your time. Thanks.
For more content on tech and leadership, Subscribe to NASScom YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update.